You've seen the movies. You've sat there in the dark, popcorn growing cold in your lap, heart pounding as the girl's eyes roll back, as the crucifix trembles, as some ancient name is shouted through clenched teeth. And somewhere in the back of your mind, maybe you thought, they made this up. Nobody could survive something like that. But here's what they never tell you. The scariest horror films, the ones that claw their way into your dreams, twist your memories, make you pause before you turn out the lights, those are the ones that didn't have to be written, because they already happened. And the real story is always worse. They called it The Exorcist. A film so disturbing that theaters once hired nurses to stand by in case someone fainted. People screamed. Some ran out. Some never finished it. It was about a girl, possessed, her body contorted, her voice no longer hers, her thoughts hijacked by something she couldn't understand, couldn't fight. And that story, it wasn't fiction. It was a record. But the person at the center of it all wasn't a girl. He was a boy, just 14, and his name is still kept secret. Because the church, the very institution that allowed the film to be made in the first place, tried to bury the real account. They locked away the files, silenced the priests, moved those who had spoken far from their home parishes. Why? Because what happened was never supposed to be known. Let's step back for a moment. Why do possession stories disturb us more than any other kind of horror? Because they blur the boundary between the body and the self. Because they suggest that the thing you trust most, your own mind, can be taken from you. Not stolen in the way memory slips or emotion clouds thought. Number taken violently, invasively, from within. Most people can walk away from slasher films, from ghost stories, from tales of survival. But possession stories, those linger, because the question they raise is deeply personal. If it happened to them, what would stop it from happening to me? In 1949, newspapers across the U.S. reported strange headlines. One read, "Priests called to investigate Maryland boy's possession." Another, "Church silent on strange case." It was never front page, always just off to the side. Like the editors didn't want to give it too much attention, but couldn't ignore it either. A boy in Cottage City, Maryland, known only by the alias Roland Doe, began to change. He had been grieving. His aunt, his favorite, had passed away unexpectedly. She was the one who introduced him to spirit boards, told him they were harmless, a game. After her death, he started using it alone. He thought maybe he could reach her. That's where it started. Scratching sounds from the walls, furniture dragging across the floor when no one was home, words appearing on his skin, long welts that looked like they'd been scratched from the inside out. And then came the voice, not his. It spoke Latin he'd never studied, blasphemies he didn't understand. It mocked priests. It lashed out. He was restrained more than once because he attacked those trying to help him, with strength no child his size should have had. His eyes were described as vacant, not in the way of sadness, in the way of someone standing at a window, watching something move from inside the house. Over the next several months, priests were rotated in and out of the case. One left permanently injured, another had a nervous breakdown. It wasn't just the boy, it was the room. Crosses flipped upside down, objects moved, the air grew heavy, suffocating. There were reports of a voice speaking through him in a tone that couldn't be replicated, low, guttural, ancient. Some say it was a hoax. Others say the documentation, the 26-page typed diary kept by one of the attending priests, is too precise, too methodical, too unlike anything Hollywood ever needed to invent. That boy was eventually moved to a hospital owned by the church. There, behind sealed doors, the final rites were performed. He screamed, he convulsed, he stopped breathing, the edge of something real. But what they leave out is far more disturbing than what they put in. In this series, we'll strip away the edits. We'll look at the cases the Warrens didn't want to talk about on camera. We'll go back to the original reports, the audio tapes, the photos that were never released to the press. And we'll ask a question no director wants you to consider. What if the movie was the watered-down version? So if this is your first time watching MindFuel, stay with us. Subscribe. Because what we uncover in the next chapters, the real truth behind these stories, isn't just about ghosts or demons. It's about belief, doubt, fear, and the terrifying possibility that once a door is opened, it doesn't always close again. This is just the beginning. We've only opened the first file. The real story behind the conjuring farmhouse is next, and it's still haunted. They say truth is stranger than fiction, but in some cases, it's not just stranger, it's darker, more confusing, and far less comforting than anything we've been shown on screen. We already told you how The Exorcist was inspired by a real case. But what happened to that boy, Roland Doe, was far more disturbing than anything the film dared to portray, because Hollywood had to stop at the line of disbelief. But the real world doesn't care about that line. And in 1949, in a quiet neighborhood in Maryland, that line was crossed. His real name is still classified. Even now, decades later, the Catholic Church will not release the boy's true identity. What we know comes from newspaper clippings, a leaked priest's diary, and whispered recollections from those who were there. Those who saw the boy, heard the things that came from his mouth, and left with questions they never wanted to ask again. The world came to know him as Roland Doe, a pseudonym chosen to protect what little of his childhood was left. He was the only child of a working-class family, raised in a quiet Lutheran home, not particularly religious, not particularly remarkable. Until one night, everything changed. It started the way these stories always seem to start, with grief. Roland was close to his aunt, a woman described as eccentric but kind. She introduced him to a Ouija board, told him it was just a game, a way to communicate with the other side. He believed her. She died suddenly, a stroke, they say, and Roland, overcome with sadness, sat down with the board again, alone this time, and asked to speak to her. But someone else answered. Soon after, the family began hearing things. The sound of footsteps, scratching behind the walls, whispers in the corners of rooms that fell silent when anyone stepped inside. They called electricians, plumbers, pest control. All found nothing. Then furniture started moving. A heavy armchair would be found turned around. No explanation. The kitchen table flipped itself during dinner once. Plates shattered. Roland began waking up covered in scratches, red welts that seemed to form words like hell and evil. The family did what any parent would do. They took him to doctors, psychiatrists. No one found anything wrong with him physically. No neurological condition, no mental illness they could diagnose. But the behavior escalated. Roland's voice changed. He began speaking in Latin fluently, a language he had never studied. He hissed at crosses. He growled at ministers. They turned to the Lutheran Church and were told he needed something they couldn't offer, so they reached out to a Catholic priest. That decision would change the course of everything that followed. Father E. Albert Hughes was the first to step forward. He agreed to a minor exorcism performed at a local hospital in Washington, D.C. What happened during that rite has been redacted from most official records, but we know that Roland broke free of his restraints, grabbed a bedspring, slashed the priest from shoulder to wrist. Hughes never performed an exorcism again. After that, the family fled Maryland and traveled to St. Louis, hoping that distance might bring peace. It didn't. There, the church approved a full-scale exorcism, and what happened in that bedroom over the course of nearly a month would eventually become the foundation for The Exorcist. The priest assigned was Father William Bowdern. He was joined by Father Raymond Bishop, and Bishop kept a diary, 26 pages, terse, methodical, devoid of embellishment, and what he recorded, day by day, hour by hour, was unlike anything the modern church had ever seen. Each night, Roland would slip into something between a trance and a seizure. He screamed. He spoke in voices that were not his own. His eyes rolled back. His body convulsed so violently, he bruised the mattress beneath him. On the second night, the word Lewis appeared on his chest, scratched into his skin from the inside out. The priests took this as a sign. They moved him to the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, under lock and key. Only clergy and a few doctors were allowed in the room. Witnesses describe impossible things: furniture levitating, the bed shaking so violently it struck the floor like a jackhammer, objects flying across the room, Bibles, holy water bottles, wooden crucifixes. Roland bit through his own lip. He spoke in guttural tones, claiming to be a demon, sometimes many. When the priests pressed for a name, the boy screamed, "I am Legion!" The priests were pushed to exhaustion. Bowdern fasted. He lost weight. His hands trembled by the second week. More than once, they were forced to physically restrain the boy. Even in restraints, he fought like a grown man. And when prayers were read, his skin blistered as if burned. They say Roland's face changed, subtly, enough that one priest reportedly left the room, vomited, and refused to return. He claimed he saw something behind the boy's eyes that didn't belong. The final exorcism took place in the hospital chapel, late March, 1949. After nearly 4 weeks of torment, something broke. Roland screamed, convulsed, and then went still. He whispered, "He is gone." And that was it. The priests said Mass. The boy was returned to his family. He lived the rest of his life in anonymity. Married, had children, worked an ordinary job. He never spoke publicly about what happened, but the priests never forgot. Father Bowdern refused to talk about it until the end of his life. Father Bishop's diary was hidden for decades. Eventually, it leaked, and the truth began to take shape. William Peter Blatty, a Georgetown student at the time, got wind of the story. He obtained the diary. He changed the boy to a girl, changed the setting to Washington, and then he wrote The Exorcist. But even he admitted later, the real case was worse. Hollywood removed the religious framing. It made it entertaining, but it left out the questions the priests still ask to this day. How could a child speak dead languages? How did those marks appear under clinical observation? How did one boy withstand a month of constant possession? And why, when it was over, did the church seal the records? The truth is, no one walked away from that case untouched. And the Catholic Church changed its policies afterward. They made exorcism training more discreet. They tightened their definitions of possessed. And they never again allowed a case like Roland's to be documented so publicly. But the story never really left, because it doesn't end in 1949. It's still being whispered about today, by priests, by skeptics, by those who wonder if maybe the veil between us and something darker isn't as thick as we want to believe. If you found yourself leaning in during this story, if your heart slowed when the prayers failed, and if you need to know what really happened in the farmhouse that inspired The Conjuring, you'll want to keep watching. Subscribe. Stay with us. Because in the next chapter, we'll travel to Rhode Island, 1971, and meet a family who thought they bought a quiet home in the country, but instead inherited a presence that still haunts the land to this day. And this time, there were photos. You've seen the movies, but you haven't heard the truth. Not like this. You've heard about the boy they called Roland Doe. You've seen The Exorcist. But what if I told you that case wasn't the only one? Not by a long shot. Because just over 2 decades later, in a quiet Rhode Island farmhouse, an entirely different kind of haunting unfolded. And it would become the foundation for what many believe is the most terrifying paranormal case ever investigated. This is the true story behind The Conjuring. But the film only showed a fraction of what really happened. Because what occurred inside that house didn't follow the rules of possession. It wasn't one entity, it wasn't contained, and it didn't stop when the cameras did. The year was 1971. Roger and Carolyn Perrin wanted a fresh start. They had 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, a growing family. So when they found a 200-acre property with a 9-bedroom farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island, the price seemed like a miracle. The land was old, generational. It had passed through many hands over the centuries, but the previous owner left one strange piece of advice. For the sake of your family, leave the lights on at night. They thought it was a joke. It wasn't. The Perrons moved in during the cold of January. Within days, the children began noticing strange things. It started with smells, rotten flesh, decaying flowers. They'd come and go without warning. Then came the noises, knocks on walls that didn't correspond with plumbing or wind. Doors creaked open that were locked minutes before. Disembodied footsteps would cross the halls at night, never hurried, never hesitant. Just walking. At first, the activity was benign, playful almost. Carolyn would find broomsticks missing, dust piles rearranged, chairs slightly pulled away from the table. One of the girls claimed to have a new friend, an unseen child who whispered secrets through the air vents. But it escalated, and when it did so with intent. Carolyn began waking up with bruises, small at first, thumb-sized, then handprints, dark, purple, deep into the skin. Roger, her husband, accused her of sleepwalking, hitting furniture, but she wasn't. Sometimes the bruises formed before she'd even left bed. And then there were the voices. Not just whispers anymore, growls, guttural tones that echoed in the rafters. One of the daughters said she heard her name being screamed right next to her ear while she was alone. The dog, who once slept indoors, now refused to enter the house. He'd whimper, scratch, growl at empty corners. Then, one day, they found him dead. The Perrons started researching the property's history. What they discovered was chilling. The land had been owned by the Arnold family since the 1700s. And the records weren't clean. There were reports of suicides, murders, accidental deaths, and children drowning in the nearby creek. But one name kept coming up, Bathsheba Sherman. She was believed to be a relative of the Arnolds by marriage. The legend said she lived on the land in the mid-19th century, that she was a practicing witch, that she sacrificed her infant child to the devil, driving a needle through the base of its skull. And when she was accused, she cursed the land and hung herself from a tree behind the barn. It was said that anyone who lived there would suffer, especially if they tried to drive her out. Carolyn became obsessed with Bathsheba, and it seemed Bathsheba returned the favor. She began appearing in mirrors. She whispered to the girls at night, and worst of all, Carolyn reported being possessed, sometimes for just minutes, other times for hours. She'd space out, her voice would change. She'd speak in languages she didn't know. Her daughters claimed they saw her levitate. Once, she was flung across the room with no one near her. Roger, now terrified, reached out to the only people he thought might understand. That's when Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived. Ed was a former Marine, a self-taught demonologist. Lorraine was a clairvoyant, quiet, reserved, devout. They'd handled dozens of cases before, but what they found in Harrisville unsettled even them. Lorraine described it as a nesting ground for spirits. Not one entity, but many. And Bathsheba was at the center of it, the dominant presence. Lorraine sensed her immediately. She refused to stay in the house overnight. She said Bathsheba's energy targeted women, especially mothers, and that Carolyn had been marked. The Warrens decided to hold a seance, not an exorcism, because technically Carolyn wasn't fully possessed. Not yet. They wanted to open a channel. They hoped to confront the spirit. Instead, they unleashed it. The seance took place in the parlor. No video footage exists, but Ed, Lorraine, and 2 local investigators were present. And so were 3 of the Perron daughters. They wished they hadn't been. The moment the seance began, Carolyn went rigid, eyes open, but blank. She started to speak in low tones, then shrieked so loud the glass in the windows vibrated. She convulsed, thrashed, screamed unintelligibly. Then, she levitated. According to all accounts, her chair rose off the floor, flipped backwards, and she hit the ground so hard her body went limp. For a full minute, she didn't move. Roger, in a panic, punched Ed Warren, screamed that they were making things worse, told them all to leave. They did, and the Perrons never allowed another spiritual investigation in their home. But the activity didn't stop. Over the next 2 years, the family continued living there, because financially, they had no choice. And slowly, the haunting seemed to lessen. Or maybe, they just became numb to it. Eventually, they moved out. But what happened to them in that house would never leave them. And Andrea Perron, the eldest daughter, would go on to write 3 full books about it, each more detailed than the last. And all of them corroborated by the Warrens' private notes. When The Conjuring was made in 2013, it sanitized much of what happened. It turned the seance into an exorcism. It offered closure, but the truth is, no priest ever stepped foot in that house. No blessing was ever completed. And to this day, Carolyn Perron has never spoken publicly about what happened during the seance. Whatever she saw, she never told. The farmhouse still stands, privately owned. Visitors report strange feelings, cold spots, voices, moving shadows. The current owners are careful not to speak too much about it. They've seen what attention can bring. But if you ask the Perron daughters today if they believe it was real, they won't hesitate. And neither did Ed and Lorraine Warren, because according to their own files, Bathsheba never left. If you're still watching, still listening, that tells us one thing. You want the truth, not the Hollywood version, not the safe version, the real one. So subscribe. Stay close, because we're not done. In the next chapter, we'll return to Connecticut, to a haunting that followed a boy from house to house, body to body. And the Warrens tried everything. They even filed a lawsuit to keep the truth from getting erased. And what you'll hear next is something that's never been shown in any movie. Before the Perrons, before the house in Harrisville, before The Conjuring reached millions on screens around the world, there was something smaller, more innocent looking, and, in many ways, far more dangerous. It didn't arrive with screams. It didn't drag furniture across a room or twist necks like in the movies. It sat quietly, unmoving, always watching. Its name was Annabelle. But what they don't tell you in the films, what they don't show on the posters, Is that the real? Annabelle looked nothing like the one you've seen on screen. It wasn't porcelain. It wasn't cold and sharp and covered in cracks. It was soft, fabric, hand-stitched. The Raggedy Ann doll, bright red yarn hair, wide triangle nose, a stitched smile. The kind of doll a child would fall asleep next to. And maybe that's why it worked. The year was 1970. Two young nursing students, Donna and Angie, shared a small apartment in Hartford, Connecticut. Donna received the doll as a birthday gift from her mother, a vintage piece, well-loved. But at first, it was just another decoration. They sat it on a rocking chair in the living room. It didn't bother anyone, for a while. Then, strange things started happening. Subtle at first. They'd come home and find the doll in a different position than where they left it, arms crossed, legs reposed. Donna assumed Angie had moved it. Angie assumed Donna had. Then it started changing rooms. They'd leave it in the living room, find it hours later in the hallway, sometimes with the door closed behind it. Then the notes started appearing, scraps of parchment paper, small, folded. Inside, childlike handwriting that said things like, "Help us. Help Lou." They didn't own parchment paper. Neither of them kept that kind of stationery, and neither of them knew who Lou was. Lou, it turned out, was Angie's boyfriend. He had always hated the doll, said there was something off about it, that it stared too long, that the room felt wrong when it was around. One night, Lou stayed over. He claimed he heard rustling in the living room. Footsteps. He thought maybe someone had broken in. He got up to check. The apartment was empty, except for the doll, now sitting upright on the floor, facing the hallway. Later that same week, Lou had a dream, or so he thought. He said he woke to find himself paralyzed, couldn't move, couldn't speak, and standing at the foot of his bed was Annabelle. But she wasn't standing. She was floating. He watched helplessly as she glided toward him, climbed up his chest. And then he felt it. Claws, digging into his neck. He woke up screaming. And when he sat up, there were 3 deep scratches across his chest, fresh, bleeding. He left the apartment. Didn't return for weeks. Donna and Angie were terrified. They reached out to a medium. They wanted answers, and what the medium told them was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The medium conducted a seance. She said she made contact with a spirit, a young girl named Annabelle Higgins. According to the story, Annabelle had died on the property years before the apartment complex was built. She was lonely. She was scared. She just wanted to be loved. Donna and Angie were moved. They said Annabelle could stay. They gave her permission. That decision changed everything. Because from that moment on, the activity escalated. Louder noises, furniture shifting on its own, more scratches, this time not just on Lou, but on Donna. And the doll began showing up in their beds. They were terrified, but also confused. They had invited her, hadn't they? But what they didn't realize, what the medium never told them, was this. Spirits do not possess objects. Demons do. And the thing inside that doll had never been a little girl. Word of the case reached Ed and Lorraine Warren. They agreed to investigate. What Lorraine found disturbed her deeply. She told Donna flatly, "There is no child. There never was. You were manipulated." What was in the apartment was a non-human entity, one that had pretended to be innocent, to be harmless, so it could gain permission to stay. And once it had that, it became nearly impossible to get rid of. The Warrens believed it was trying to possess a human host, to take control of one of them. Maybe Donna, maybe Lou, maybe even the medium. They arranged for a priest to bless the apartment. Then they took the doll. But even that didn't go smoothly. On the way back to their home in Monroe, Connecticut, The Warrens' car stalled multiple times. Brakes failed. Engine died. At one point, Ed poured holy water over the doll in the back seat just to keep it from interfering with the road. When they got home, they locked it in Ed's study. But the disturbances continued. The doll would shift position, disappear from one room, and appear in another. Eventually, they had a wooden case constructed. They placed the doll inside, lined it with prayers, and sealed the edges with holy relics. That case still exists, and Annabelle still rests inside it. The Warren Occult Museum, their private collection, has been closed to the public for years. But inside that room, behind the glass, is the real Annabelle. Not porcelain, not cracked, not glamorous, just a fabric doll, sitting perfectly still. But many who've stood near it claim to feel uneasy, as if they're being watched, judged. Some have claimed to hear scratching sounds behind the glass. Others swear they've seen the doll shift positions from one visit to the next. There are rumors that a man once mocked it, pounded on the glass, and dared it to do something. He died in a motorcycle crash on the way home. The museum's staff won't confirm that, but they won't deny it either. The lesson in Annabelle's case isn't just about possession, it's about invitation, permission, and the consequences of assuming that something harmless can't be dangerous. Because sometimes evil wears a familiar face. Sometimes it stitches itself into soft fabric, into yarn smiles, into kind eyes. Sometimes it just waits for you to let it in. If you're still listening, still watching, that means you're ready to go further. Because the next case, it isn't about dolls or haunted houses. It's about a family torn apart, a child possessed, and a courtroom that became the battleground between science and the supernatural. In Chapter 5, Bearer will explore the haunting in Connecticut, a case so dark, so chaotic, that even the Warrens refused to speak about it for years. You won't find this version in the movie, so stay with us, subscribe, and return to hear the part they left out. Because real horror never ends when the credits roll. It looked like a new start. In the summer of 1986, Carmen Snedeker and her husband, Alan, packed up their family and moved to a modest duplex in Southington, Connecticut. It wasn't their first choice, but time was short. Their eldest son, Philip, had just been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and he needed regular cancer treatments at the nearby hospital. The family, Carmen, Alan, their 3 sons, and young niece, needed a place close to the medical center. They found one. Affordable, spacious, quiet, too quiet. The rent was low. The landlord didn't ask many questions, and that should have been the first clue, because what the family didn't know, what no one told them, was that the house had once been a funeral home. The discovery didn't come from a real estate listing. It came from what they found in the basement. Downstairs, behind a boarded-up door, was a set of metal gurneys, a cold chamber used for storing bodies, embalming tools still laid out on a stained workbench. There was even a lift used to carry coffins up to the viewing room, unplugged, rusted, but still there. The Snedekers hadn't rented a home. They had moved into a space that once held the dead. And whatever had once lingered in those rooms hadn't left. The changes started almost immediately. Philip, already weakened from radiation treatments, began to act differently. At first, they thought it was the illness. Then, they thought it might be the medication. But what they couldn't explain were the things he began to see. He said there were shadows in the hallway, that they moved, even when the lights were on, that they whispered. He said that something came into his room at night, that it would watch him while he slept, and that it wasn't human. He described a man in a dark suit with hollow eyes, another figure with long black hair, hunched and silent. He said they never spoke, but they smiled, and then he stopped sleeping altogether. Soon the rest of the family began experiencing things too. Carmen would find items moved, drawers opened. She'd hear footsteps in the attic knocking in the walls. Then there was the shower curtain. One morning she stepped into the bathroom and saw that the curtain had been shredded from top to bottom. Long, jagged slashes, like someone or something had clawed it down the middle. There were no pets in the house, and no one admitted to doing it. She replaced it. A week later, it happened again. The children grew quiet, withdrawn. One of the younger sons said a woman's voice would sing to him at night. At first, it was soft, almost comforting. Then it became harsh, commanding. It would tell him to do things. By the end of the month, that same boy was caught trying to harm himself with a kitchen knife. He said he wasn't trying to die. He said the lady told him he had to. Alan Snedeker, the father, began drinking heavily. He said it was stress. Bills. His son's condition. But Carmen would later say there were nights he would stare at a fixed point on the wall and whisper to it. She thought he was losing his mind. Maybe they all were. When things reached a breaking point, Carmen reached out for help. She contacted the only people she could think of: Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens arrived with a team of investigators. They brought cameras, tape recorders, equipment, and according to Ed Warren, the activity in that house was among the most violent they had ever encountered. Lorraine said the house carried the imprint of death, a residue. She believed the funeral home's workers had engaged in necromancy, the ritualistic summoning of spirits. There were claims of sexual violation of corpses, of desecrated remains, of doors opened that should have never been touched. Whether those rumors were true remains unverified. But according to the Warrens, the energy left behind was twisted, distorted, and it had latched onto Philip first because he was the most vulnerable. The investigators documented objects moving, lights flickering, sudden extreme drops in temperature. One member of the team reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown after spending a night alone in the basement. He refused to return. The Warrens arranged for an exorcism. It lasted several hours. Prayers were said in every room. Holy water was poured down the basement drains. Protective seals were drawn in chalk. After the ritual, the house grew quiet. The activity stopped. Philip was relocated to a hospital. His treatment resumed. The rest of the family moved out shortly afterward. But the damage was done. Years later, the story was adapted into a major motion picture, The Haunting in Connecticut. The film added its own twists. Hollywood rewrote certain moments, softened others, exaggerated a few. But what was left out, what they couldn't include, was the uncertainty, the contradictions, because not everyone agrees on what happened in that house. Some skeptics claim the story was fabricated, that the family made it up, that the Warrens were too eager to believe, that Carmen had approached a writer before ever contacting the church. Others point to real-time journal entries, photographs, recordings of unexplained sounds. There's no clear consensus. Even the surviving family members differ in how they remember it. But here's what no one has ever explained: why Philip's behavior shifted so drastically the moment they moved in, why the basement was sealed off, why the shower curtain kept tearing, why investigators left the house in fear, and most chilling of all, why everyone who lived there agrees that once they left, the silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like containment. Whether the house in Southington was haunted, or whether the trauma of illness and fear created its own kind of madness, one thing is clear. Some places remember what happened inside them, and some echoes don't fade. They wait for the next family, the next open door, the next child too sick to fight back. You can tear down walls, replace curtains, sell the property. But what lingers in a place like that? doesn't leave with the owners. If this chapter held your attention, if the darkness behind the walls still lingers in your thoughts, then you're ready for what's next. Because Chapter 6 will take us into one of the most chilling possessions ever recorded. A case that didn't end in an exorcism. It ended in a murder. Stay with us, subscribe, and return to hear the real story behind The Devil Made Me Do It. Because when horror is real, justice has to face it too. If you think you've heard the worst, think again. What lies ahead isn't just haunting. It questions the very nature of truth, belief, and how far fear can stretch before it becomes something else entirely. Because next, we journey into the world's most disputed house of horror, where truth and fabrication may be one and the same. But that's just the beginning. In Volume 2, the darkness deepens. Some stories are famous, others long buried. But each one leaves behind a trail of real people, real terror, and unanswered questions. Subscribe to MindFuel and join us as we uncover the next 5 stories that defy explanation and may make you question your own reality. You've heard the whispers.